Hey guys, in this episode I talked to an old uni mate of mine, a registered dietitian and a nutritional science extraordinaire, Holly, and she shares some absolutely fantastic information around nutrition practices for hiking and trekking, which you can use both on and off the trail. So gear up, it's an absolute jam-packed episode full of great learning for you, and I really do hope you enjoy it. Hey, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming hike, trek or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode. To start off with, for everyone listening, I'd love if you could just share a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what makes you different from just any old person offering nutrition coaching.
Yeah, right. So I am an accredited practicing dietitian and accredited sports dietitian. So what that means is I've gone to uni and I've got 2 degrees. So I have a Bachelor of Exercise and Sports Science and a Master's of Nutrition and Dietetics. So I guess what makes me different from anyone else or any old person offering nutrition coaching is just not everyone who is offering nutrition coaching necessarily has credentials to be doing so. I guess there was actually an interesting study that came out of Scotland earlier this year that came out and said most advice given on Instagram by influencers is wrong. So I guess that's a big difference there. On the note of giving advice, I think it's important that I also preface this by saying that any nutrition advice I give today is general advice only, because every single person is different and therefore nutrition specifics for individuals for hiking can be vastly different. So if any listeners are looking for specific or individualised advice, I'd recommend they catch up with a sports dietitian so that the plan is tailored for them. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
100% I can get around that. And, you know, it was with everything, you know, what we're talking about on the podcast. It's all general recommendations, but if, everyone's an individual for every single thing. So 100%, I'm always trying to push people I talk to see a specialist in the field. And as you said, Instagram's not really the best source of information, even though that's how we tend to consume content these days. But I'm really stoked to have you on because there's so much, you know, with everything in the nutrition and the training world, there's just so much misinformation floating around. So it's really going to be great just to pick your brains a little bit and hopefully we can get a little bit of evidence-based information that we can share to the hiking and the trekking world.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always keen to promote the evidence base in nutrition, for sure.
Well, let's get into it then. So to start up, let's just keep it really, really, really basic. So I'd love to explore a little bit about the types of foods that hikers or trekkers would be wanting to eat before or during a day of hiking, and then what particular benefits that people could maybe gain by putting a little bit of thought around this.
Yeah, okay. So there's a few different points here. I guess for hikers, the foods to focus on differs a bit based on, I guess, the location of the hike, the duration of the hike, the intensity. Those are big factors that can make a big difference. For example, at altitude, you have a high demand for carbohydrates. Meaning if your hike is at high altitude, you need to be focusing even more on that. But as a general rule, on the day of hiking or before and during, the key nutrient to focus on is going to be carbohydrates. It is going to be the main fuel source for the hike. So having a good load of carbs before the hike and throughout the hike is going to help, firstly, maximize the stored carbs before it to reduce the time it takes to fatigue, and then also have carb top-ups throughout the hike to make sure the energy stays adequate throughout. The other nutrient that you'd be wanting to focus on is protein as well. Not as much needed as carbohydrates, but it's important for recovery and it also is the part of food that helps you feel full. So having a low to moderate amount of protein throughout the day while you're hiking would be important. And then afterwards, you'd focus more on the protein there too. But beforehand, it'd primarily be the carbohydrates. So a day of hiking might look like, if it was a one-day hike, you might have the main meal 2 to 3 hours before you go on a hike that's got a good source of low GI carbs. So it might be some porridge or some grainy toast for brekkie. And then again, about an hour before the hike, I'd have a top up of a moderate GI carb, so a moderate release in energy carbohydrate. And then throughout the day, you'd be looking to have high GI carbs intermittently throughout. And I guess how aggressive you are with this and the frequency and duration, frequency and amount of these, you have would depend on the intensity and the duration of the hike. But generally speaking, for really intense activity that goes for long periods of time, for example, if you're looking at marathons and likening it to that sort of thing, it can be 30 grams to 60 grams per hour of carbohydrates that we'd recommend, up to kind of 90 grams per hour. So again, that really depends on like the intensity and duration of the hike, but generally carbs are going to be the main focus for the day of the hike. And then with any stoppages you have throughout the hike, I would recommend having a bit more of a lower GI carb there. So say you stop for a meal, then have something a bit more substantial, but then throughout the rest of the hike, having those small top-ups would be useful. The other thing to consider for hiking is not necessarily on the day of the hike, but iron levels is really important, particularly in altitude. Your iron demands are increased. So iron is what carries oxygen around the body, which allows us to do work. So if people are low in iron, which is quite prevalent, particularly in females, endurance athletes, and vegans or vegetarians, if you have any of those listening, iron is really important. So that'd be something I'd be looking at considering all year round as opposed to just around the hike, but it can make a big difference to hike performance. And then the other thing that might want to be considered on the day of is caffeine. Caffeine can improve performance or like just general feeling in the hike based on its ability to reduce perception of effort. So it can make the hike seem easier than it is for longer, perhaps. But caffeine is one of the most research supplements that can have a massive impact on performance across all sorts of activity. So that might be something else that people consider. And I guess the other thing to note as well is if it is a big hike or it is a multiple day hike, carbohydrate loading might be something worth considering, which is commonly misunderstood as just being a bowl of pasta the night before. But actual carb loading is much more than that. Carb loading can be up to 2 to 3 days of high carb eating of about 7 to 12 grams of carbohydrates a day, which if you think about what that is, if you're, say, a 70-kilo person, times that by 7 to 12, it's a fair bit of carbohydrates to be consuming in a day, a lot more than just a bowl of pasta the night before. But that can ideally maximize the stored carbohydrate you have in your muscles, which can then obviously have more energy available to you on the day of the hike or on the days of the hikes. So I guess to summarize what I just said, it's mainly looking at carbs on the day of the hike with a bit of protein throughout, but carbs are going to be a main fuel source.
All right, beautiful. Some golden information in there. It's just chock full there. I absolutely love it.
I think I took a few different directions there. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's exactly what I'm after. There's a few little follow-up questions I've got here. So you talked about little top-ups of carbohydrates while you're hiking, so stuff that's a bit higher GI, which might be a bit quicker digesting. I know a really common thing that I hear from trekkers and I see on the internet forums and I get questions myself is people concerned about these high GI things. So like there might be sugary snacks or there might be gummy bears or whatever these common recommendations for hikings are. They're concerned about these sugar crashes while they're on the trail. So is that something they should be concerned about if they're eating that type of food while they're actually hiking?
I wouldn't be so concerned with that, no. And I think that brings it back down to the duration and intensity of the hike. Say, for example, it's a 3-hour hike. Those high GI top-ups aren't going to result in a crash. If it's, say, a 10-hour hike, then you might be looking at having more moderate GI carbohydrates, so it does help sustain the energy levels a bit better. But like I said, with the stoppages, so high GI obviously has a quick release of energy, which means it can have a quick come down. That also just brings back to the importance of those, say you have a big stoppage where you have a meal, making sure there's a good solid dose of low GI carbs in that as well. But if you're relying on low GI carbs throughout for top-ups, the energy just won't be available quick enough to be utilized properly and effectively.
Okay, perfect. I think that clears it up pretty easily. So beautiful there. Next is GI. So, high GI, low GI, we hear it a lot. If someone was wanting to go sort of research what foods are, what GI and what might be fitting into where they want to be eating on the trail, is there any particular places you might be able to point them, any resources or websites which might be a bit more respectable than just a random Google search?
Yeah, the University of Sydney has a GI database. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think if you type into Google Sydney University GI database, it would come up, and basically it has a whole list of, particularly for Australians, Australian-based foods and their GI value, and goes through. So knowing what GI means is important when you look at that, though. So the different ranges, to know what is low, what's moderate, and what's high is important. That would be my probably go-to website, because, yeah, like you said, there's a lot of stuff in Google, but you want to kind of rely on a reputable source, and university tends to be a pretty good way to go.
Fantastic. I'll dig that up, and for anyone listening, I'll put the link to that down in the show notes for you to check it out, so you should just be able to scroll down and find that. Next, I want to talk about, you briefly touched on iron. So I know iron's a really, really tricky subject. How would someone know if they might be low in iron? And number two, if they were 100% sure they were low in iron, what sort of would be the best way of going about bringing it up in a general sense?
Yeah. So some common symptoms of iron, I think the best way to know if you're low in iron is there's some common symptoms you might feel. So fatigue, like constant tiredness without really having any real reason for it, like getting good sleep, eating well, but still feeling tired all the time. That's a big one that I see in athletes and a lot of people I work with. Another big thing is if you are female and you are doing a lot of endurance activity and you are vegan or vegetarian, you are at higher risk of being low in iron, because females have higher losses. Endurance athletes have high demands for iron, and vegans and vegetarians typically, not always, this is nothing against them, but typically can have a lower iron intake because they're not consuming red meat. So if you're feeling like tired all the time and you don't know why, or you're one of those other three categories, it's as simple as going to the doctor and requesting a blood test to see where you're at and see where your stored iron is, so your ferritin. The doctor will get results and be able to tell you what it all means for you. And from there, basically, it might involve increasing your iron intake in your food, or it may involve supplementation. And I know that supplementation is actually quite commonly used, for example, in winter sport athletes because of the higher demands at altitude. So that might be something to consider anyway. But to know where you're at, the best thing to do is to go to the doctor, get a test, and that'll be able to show you plain and simply where you're at.
And I know in the trekking world, and particularly the altitude trekking world, there are a few people who sort of skip that step, going to see the doctor, and they just immediately grab a supplement and just think it's going to be helping them. Is there a bit of an issue in this approach?
I guess the only thing that I would consider is that it's worth checking your own status, because you could be completely fine. In fact, there is a condition called hemochromatosis, which is mostly genetic. It's a condition where you have abnormally high iron. So if you have that condition and you start taking iron supplements, that's not going to be very useful, and that can actually be harmful. So yeah, I would just recommend to anyone, if you're considering taking a supplement, it's worth checking what your status is first, because it may not be necessary. In fact, it may be harmful. Just the same with any kind of supplement in general. You really need to establish whether it's needed for you and assess your individual case, regardless of what the media or what the internet might say. And before any supplement, if you're unsure, definitely talk to your doctor beforehand.
Perfect. I wanted to make that point there, because a lot of people, particularly, this day and age, supplements first thing you reach to, and you don't really know whether it's necessary or whether it's doing you good or harm or whatever. So I always try to tell people, go to the doctor and suss it out before you reach for anything crazy.
Something I talk to a lot in terms of supplements in athletes, it's kind of like the icing on top of a cake. So I even like to call it the sprinkles on top of the icing on top of the cake. The cake being the healthy, balanced diet, the icing being the timing of your nutrients. So, carbs before activity, protein after activity. Then the sprinkles on top of that are the supplements. So you can't really have the sprinkles unless you've got the cake first. I think that's a nice way of thinking about it, that it can be useful and they can be really beneficial for performance and health, but you've got to consider those other two things first before you can have the sprinkles.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to have to steal that analogy, I think. It's funny. Yeah. Every time I have a guest on this podcast, I always get one fantastic analogy, which I've been stealing. And it's just been adding to my little toolbox of them. So there we go.
I definitely didn't make that one up myself. It's probably from another sports dietitian. But yeah, it is a very good one. I'm happy for you to steal that.
Perfect. And then one more follow-up question from that. You mentioned caffeine being something that can be beneficial having before exercise or before hiking. One common concern, again, that I hear people quite often spread around in the hiking world, the trekking world, and just in the general world is caffeine can dehydrate you, and that's going to put you in an issue. If you're up at altitude, dehydration's an issue. Or if you're on the trail, dehydration's an issue. So what do you have to say about caffeine and dehydration?
I think it depends on the source of the caffeine. So if you're drinking copious amounts of coffee and you're urinating a lot, then hydration might become an issue. I think hydration is quite a massive topic in itself, and that's something you've got to establish or to figure out as an individual what's going to work for you. There are different ways to have caffeine, so it doesn't need to be through fluid. It could be, no-dose tablets. It could be those things you put in your mouth that dissolve on your tongue that has caffeine, or it could be caffeinated chewing gum. They're not going to necessarily dehydrate you much. More looking at your fluid balance that's going to have a greater impact there. So again, coming back to that individualized protocol for that would be important. But there's absolutely no doubt that caffeine can improve performance. So if people are looking for that improvement, those little 1%ers, it can definitely play a role there.
So that's very interesting. So the no dose and the gum and that, they won't have as much of effect on your hydration as the coffee.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't believe so. As long as you have your fluid and hydration strategy down pat to ensure you're still drinking enough and managing your losses that you have.
Oh, interesting. I used to live off no dose back in the uni days when I knew you. It was before I turned into a chronic coffee drinker. It was just no dose after no dose. So.
Yeah.
There you go. So I think that's the perfect lead into the next question. We're talking about hydration, because hydration is another really, really misunderstood thing in the trekking world, particularly when it comes to hydration and electrolytes. And most people seem to know that electrolytes are good while you're out on the trail in one sense or another, but no one really understands, what they actually are and how they work and what's causing these benefits or what the actual benefits are. And it's just really, really confusing out there. So could you give a bit of a rundown on this?
Yeah, so hydration is one of those things that can easily be neglected, I see, in a lot of athletes and general population, but it does have a massive role in performance, and it's a really important part of nutrition and the nutrition strategy for any kind of activity, especially hiking. Because when we're dehydrated, our cognitive capacity declines, so our skill execution and decision-making ability is reduced, our muscles fatigue faster, the heart has to work harder to pump blood around the body, our temperature regulation is impaired, and generally, just in general, our perception of effort is greater. So things feel harder than they would if we were hydrated. So it just comes down to 2% dehydration that can have a massive impact on performance. So that's pretty small amount of fluid loss to have a great impact on performance. So what happens when we exercise is we sweat. And when we sweat, we lose both fluid and electrolytes, meaning both need to replace adequately to rehydrate. And some of these electrolytes mainly include sodium. So sodium is important because it aids fluid uptake. So you can drink lots of water, but with the salt or the sodium, it helps retain that fluid. It also makes us feel thirstier, which makes us more inclined to drink. And then chloride as well helps the body to retain fluid. Potassium is another important one that's important for nerve and muscle function. But something that's really important and worth noting when it comes to hydration and electrolytes is that everyone's really different. Everyone's sweat rate is really different. So on the internet, you may read you should have this many mils per hour, etc. Yeah, those things might be a good guide, but sweat rates can be really, really different between individuals, meaning that the hydration strategy for two individuals could be very, very different. The other thing worth noting is that the environment has a massive impact on hydration and risk of dehydration. So, for example, in really hot or humid environments where sweat losses are greater, hydration may need to be a lot more aggressive, or hydration strategy. Whereas in cold environments and high altitude, the thirst sensation can be reduced, as well as appetite, making people less inclined to drink voluntarily. So it can become a bit of an issue there too, that dehydration occurs because people aren't thinking to drink as much. But the environment plays a massive role in that. But I guess the key is with hydration and hiking is an individualized plan. So figuring out your own sweat losses. A way to do that could be weighing yourself before and after exercise bout, and whatever weight you lose, you need to replace that by 150% afterwards. So for example, if I lost a kilo doing a hike, that means that afterwards I would need to drink 1.5 litres to replace that. But not just fluid, like you said, electrolytes. So that might mean I have salty foods. I might have sports drink can be useful, or electrolyte supplements like hydrolyte, that can be useful because they help to retain the fluid we consume. What's important to note as well is try to drink to thirst when you're hiking and exercising. Thirst is going to be the best way to know if you're drinking the right amount for you personally. And the other thing you can monitor to see if you're hydrated, and I do get all my athletes to do this, is to start practicing looking at their urine colour. So just generally you want to look for pale coloured urine. If your urine is dark, that means you are dehydrated. So pale or straw coloured is the place to be when it comes to urine. But yeah, overall, dehydration has a massive impact on performance. So hydration is really important. When it comes to being hydrated and getting back to you hydrated, it comes down to fluid and electrolytes. And a big reason for the electrolytes' importance is that they help retain the fluid. And it's important to keep those electrolytes within the right balance and concentration in our blood for overall health.
Perfect. I think that covered a whole bunch there. So that's fantastic once again. I'm curious, you said if you do that strategy to determine your individual hydration needs, where you weigh yourself before and after, and you said to replenish by 150%. I'm just curious why the extra 50%?
That's just what it's going to take to get back to you hydrated. That's what the research has shown, that you need to replace it. But it's 125 to 150% to get back to that you hydration. So if you think about, I know I've had athletes in pre-football season training in the middle of summer with massive conditioning sessions, have lost up to 3 kilos of fluid. So that means afterwards they need to drink 4.5 litres of fluid to get back to that euhydrated status. Yeah, that's just what that number just comes from the research and what has been found to bring that back, that stable place.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That's really, really good to know. Next question, following up from that, is the topic of hyponatremia, which is another big one in the hiking world, particularly with so many people going out on, tropical treks, whether it's the Kokoda Trail or hiking in Australia or whatever. And I know it's, a relatively serious condition, but it's probably, again, one of the most confusing ones in the trekking world. And there's some really, really horrendous advice going around on the internet. To start with, maybe what is hyponatremia, just as general, and then how likely is it to happen when you're actually hiking? And then what should you be doing to prevent it?
Yeah, okay. So hyponatremia basically refers to low blood serum, like blood sodium. So a low amount of salt in your blood, sodium in your blood. So defined as less than 135 millimoles per litre. And generally we want to keep our blood sodium at around 135 to 145. That's it in the kind of scientific terms, but basically it just means you're low sodium in your blood. And this often happens due to excess intake of fluid without adequate electrolyte replacement. So if you lose lots of sweat and then just drink lots of fluid, the concentration of that sodium drops. And when rapid changes in sodium levels occur, it can lead to symptoms like headaches, nausea, vomiting, weakness, seizures, and it can, like you said, be a really serious condition that can lead to coma and death if not treated early enough and adequately. So in terms of how easily it could happen hiking, I think the likelihood really depends on the environment again. So in terms of temperature, humidity, fluid intake, electrolyte intake, altitude, exercise intensity, all these kind of factors will play a role in the likelihood of it happening. Generally speaking, it is a relatively rare condition. However, it is something to be mindful of. So if you do have great big sweat losses and you're drinking a lot of fluid, particularly in one hit, it does mean that your sodium levels can drop significantly. So the best way to prevent it is to consistently drink small amounts of fluid and consume electrolytes before, during, and after hiking. So instead of just drinking, chugging 2 litres in one hit, spreading that kind of fluid out across the day and drinking to thirst. I'd also encourage on hikes to have salty foods with you or add some of those electrolyte solutions to your water to help add in the sodium as well to keep that concentration of sodium in the blood within normal range. But yeah, it just comes down to personal sweat losses and what that means. It indicates in terms of fluid replacement, electrolyte replacement, based on how much is lost.
Okay, so on longer treks, a lack of fresh fruit and vegetable becomes pretty common, and foods just tend to get simpler and simpler and simpler. And there sometimes becomes the worry of this sort of nutritional deficiency, plus a bit of like constant fatigue, seeing you hiking all day for multiple days and not sleeping so well. And then just simply getting sick can become a pretty common issue. And if someone's on a longer trek and without access to fresh foods, what are some solutions that might be able to just keep them a bit more healthy generally?
So I think what can be really useful is replacing some of those fresh fruit and veg with things like canned fruit and veg, pureed fruit, dried fruit can be really useful. Dates are one of my favourite go-to high GI snacks. Soups can be really useful. So pre-made vegetable soups, good dose of veggies in there. Baked beans, fermentable veggies, sauerkraut. I guess one of the key nutrients involved in immunity and helping stop cold and flu, preventing cold and flu would be vitamin C, and that's where fruit and veg becomes really important. The other thing would be probiotics. Helps maintain a healthy gut, which helps keep the immune system strong, hence the recommendation for some fermented veggies if that's possible to carry. But then also just maintaining regular protein intake to recover properly from the days of hiking so you don't get run down, because ultimately exercise is a stressor that puts strain on the immune system. Unless we recover properly, that strain just stays there and the immune system stays compromised. The other thing that might be worth considering is multivitamin to take if it is a particularly long one and some of these foods are harder to carry, or a vitamin C supplement. The other thing that might be worth considering is if you start to feel the symptoms of cold and flu, zinc supplementation can help reduce the severity and duration of that cold and flu. But I guess, it comes down to overall energy intake as well, just making sure that you're recovering properly and eating enough to sustain the amount of output you're giving to the hike.
One thing that I was researching the other day for my little altitude course that I sell, and I was trying to find foods that were high in vitamin C, but were they wouldn't go off, and they were, fresh fruits, obviously carrying them for 10 days is not going to be the nicest thing in your bag. And I was trying to find particular foods that could be high in vitamin C, but they could just carry around in their bag and there wouldn't be any issue. Like, off the top of your head, would you have any recommendations there?
I think looking to dried fruit as the main source. But again, fresh fruit and veggies, like things like kiwi fruit and capsicum, are going to be the highest sources of it. So then in those cases, it might also come down to supplementing if that's possible as well. So getting vitamin C, the chewable tablets that you can carry with you, that might be something worth considering.
Last question here. We've got the very, very big one for last. So we're going to be talking about fat adaptation, which is probably, we're going to get a bit of blowback from this because people are very, very, very passionate about it. So I don't know what your opinion on it is either way, but we're going to dig into it. And the strategy of fat adaptation is, as I said, a really, really big thing in the trek and the mountaineering world. A lot of people and a lot of very well-known companies are very, very adamant that it's very, very good, and they're very, very pro fat adaptation strategy. Personally, I don't tend to recommend it to my clients purely because, I'm not a dietitian, but also I'm not a big fan of any type of dietary restriction in any sense.
Yeah.
But I do know there are lots and lots of listeners out there who are genuinely trying to make this happen, and whether or not it's the best case for them or not, like, they're trying to put this into action and get the benefits. So a few questions on this. Could you explain what the strategy of fat adaptation actually is and how it works, what the benefits of this type of thing might be, and what the drawbacks might be as well? And then maybe any common mistakes people should be aware of if they are choosing to go down this road.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on not being a fan of any type of dietary restriction unless there's a clinical indication for it. I think dietary restrictions can promote obsession around eating but become quite unhealthy, both physically and mentally. And it also means cutting out food groups that have nutrients that potentially cannot be adequately replaced by other foods. And I think what's also important to note is that while media and the internet and all sorts of people might be promoting one way of eating as the only way of doing things, as the healthiest form, and everything else is terrible, there's definitely no one way of eating that is going to be superior to everything else. There's different diet frameworks that work for different individuals. So I'll preface this by saying I don't recommend this kind of thing, but if someone is wanting to do this kind of thing, I can most definitely support it and to make sure it's done as healthily as possible. But essentially what it means is that you adapt to using fat as your primary fuel source as opposed to using carbohydrates. So our bodies want to use carbohydrates. Our preferred fuel source for the brain is glucose, the most simple form of a carbohydrate. So it has been found, though, that if we switch to a lower carb and relatively low protein diet, you can switch your body to using fat as the main fuel. And when you have a high fat diet, low carb diet, it increases the amount of fat we metabolize. And the reason this might be desirable is because if you think about the amount of stored carbohydrate we have, which is called glycogen, we have about 400 to 600 grams of glycogen stored within the body, in the muscle and the liver. If you think about fat, we can have kilos of fat stored. So the reason fat adaptation might be desirable is because we have a bigger supply of it stored within us to utilize. The idea of that being beneficial is mean you have a large supply of it, so we will run out more slowly than we do with carbohydrates. It's worth noting, though, that fat is not as economical as carbohydrate in terms of metabolism. So you actually get more bang for your buck, so ATP being the energy that's produced, with carbohydrate metabolism than we do for fat metabolism using the same amount of oxygen. So if, for example, you're hiking in altitude where oxygen is reduced, this must be a consideration to consider, that you're going to need, with less oxygen, you want to be making the most of the oxygen you have, and carbohydrate is going to be a much more effective fuel source there. Essentially, to summarize what I just said, a low-carb, high-fat diet can influence fuel utilization, so move from using carbohydrates to using fat primarily. But so far, there's insufficient evidence to say this has any performance benefit over carbohydrate. It can be useful. I'm not saying it's harmful, but there's no benefit of doing it over using carbohydrates at this stage. That could change, like anything in science, but currently that's where it's at. Some of the drawbacks to me would be, like you said, dietary restrictions. I generally try not to promote them because they can become obsessive and unhealthy mentally, given that food and nutrition is largely mental, and the relationship with food is really important. That's something that I avoid for that reason. The other thing is that generally a high-fat, low-carb diet is very low in fiber, and fiber is really important for the gut microbiome, and the research into the gut microbiome these days and the importance of it for overall health is booming. They're calling the gut the second brain. And so the gut microbiome is really important, and given that a high-fat diet needs to be quite low in vegetables to keep that carbohydrate low so that we still use fat as the main fuel source, it means it's quite low in vegetables and fruit and grains and good things that are really good for the gut microbiome. So that's one issue that I do see with it. The other thing is it's relatively low in dairy as well, for, again, the same reason. To maintain that low-carb intake, dairy is really difficult to have on a high-fat diet, and that has implications in terms of calcium intake. And with osteoporosis kind of booming in the Western world, calcium is one of the key nutrients we need to prevent that, to keep strong bones. So that's another issue that I do see as something that needs to be considered. I guess then the long-term impacts of this kind of way of eating on long-term health aren't overly well established yet. And so that's something else to consider, how this kind of food intake will impact things like cardiovascular health in the long run. Oh, and one big one too is enjoyment. I'm all about enjoying what you eat. And if you enjoy eating high-fat foods only, then great. But if you don't enjoy it, then there's no need to do it. If you like your carbohydrates, maintain the carbohydrates. And I guess some common mistakes I see people make is that it is very low carb. So if you have carbohydrates, you have too much carbohydrates, your body will switch back to using carbohydrates as fuel because that's what it wants to use. So it has to be consistently, very diligently, low carbohydrate to get the impact. For example, another issue I've had before is I've had a client tell me that they just eat a wheel of brie and salami every day on their high-fat diet. And you can imagine the terror I had when she said that to me. I found that very scary. But those are the kind of common mistakes I see there. But I guess, above all, while I won't promote it myself, there obviously can be a place for it if you choose to do it, though I do not believe that it is necessary unless you particularly are passionate about it. If you like to have carbohydrates, keep them in your diet. They can be really nutritious, and they are a great fuel source as well for endurance activity.
I really agree with what you said there. Like, I've had a couple of clients in the past who have been training for endurance events, and they've been put onto these type of diets by their coaches or recommended by their coaches. And they both said to me, I love my pasta, I love my bread, but I'm dropping this for whatever reason to perform and get the edge on their competition. But then every weekend or every 10 days, they'd fall off the wagon and go out and binge on, the things they were missing and the restriction they were missing. And I was just trying to get through their head. It was like, you're beating yourself up and making yourself feel guilty for not doing this strategy, which is just totally not necessary for you and it's not suited for you. But it was just this terrible cycle of just, guilt, binging, and then just going around and around. And in the end, I don't think you got any of the benefits out of it either way.
And that mental aspect of it is just so important and often gets underappreciated, how much the behavior and the mental side of eating comes into play. And that's something that really needs to be nurtured as well. I think another thing to note there too is that the exercise intensity, if you're exercising at a high intensity, which when you're a top endurance athlete, you can be exercising at a very high intensity for the whole time. That's what makes, the top marathon runners in the world so good at what they do, is they can maintain high intensity exercise for a ridiculously long period of time. And when you get to a certain exercise intensity, your body will not use fat anymore because it's not very economical use of energy. It takes too long to be metabolized and to give that energy. So you have to use carbohydrates. So once you get sort of towards the 75 to 80% of the exercise max intensity, you are going to use carbohydrates. So that's another flaw there with that, in that you won't be able to exercise at high intensities on a high fat diet. That's not to say, though, that a low carb framework can't be used periodically. There is actually some evidence and some strategies in terms of using low carb periodically can be really effective for training. So, for example, you may have heard of this training low. A way of strategically getting a bit of training adaptation from this is you might, for example, do a glycogen depleting training session one evening. And so it's a long, intense training where you use all your stored carbohydrates, your glycogen. Then you don't eat any carbs after that. You go to bed, you wake up, and you do another training session without having any carbohydrates beforehand. And basically, this means that training session is low in carbohydrates. You've got minimal carbohydrates to use for that session. And what it can do is upregulate your ability to utilize glycogen and actually improve your ability to use it for other sessions. So while I don't promote chronic high-fat diets, there can be a real place for periodization with it and using low-carb training sessions to improve training adaptation. And it just provides a different type of stress. So in that training session the next morning, you're not going to be able to perform as well as you would if you'd had carbs, but it provides a different kind of stress for the body and the brain to cope with, which whenever we're trying to get fitter or stronger in exercise or sport, the different types of stress can make us better.
I know people, some of the big names in the trekking world and the mountaineering world who recommend this type of stuff. They do dive into that quite a bit. So I'm glad you touched on that because that's very interesting to know. One last thing to pick your brains on is, I know another thing that I do commonly see or hear from people is with this low carb. Sorry to harp in on this subject, but it's something I want to really dive into. Is they'll do all their training low carb and they get their fat adaptations and they very, very diligent on all. But when they go to perform for their event or they go up on the mountain or they go on the trek, they maintain that low carb and still are really, really avert to carbohydrates while they're doing that. My understanding, I don't know if it's 100% correct or not, but my understanding is the strategy is if you do get those adaptations, you do your training like carbohydrate depleted and yada, yada, yada. But when you actually get to your race or get to your trek or get to your climb, then you reintroduce the carbohydrates to get the benefits of both worlds. Is that correct, or is that a bit old school thinking from my end?
No, that's definitely true. So if you use the low carb, high fat periodically, so say the most I'd ever get someone to do would be once a week, is to do the whole train low situation, then you definitely need to be having carbohydrates then when you perform, because you're just not going to perform as well as if you had carbohydrates. In terms of if you have a chronically high fat, low carb diet, then when you perform carbohydrates, your utilization of that as fuel would be down regulated. So you probably would just stick to the fat because your body isn't used to using the carbohydrates effectively. But yeah, important to note that if you do the whole low carb, high fat periodically, so say once a week, you do have a training session where you're very low carb, you definitely need to be using the carbs again than when you perform, because the whole purpose of doing those training sessions low is to be able to improve your ability to metabolize glycogen and carbohydrates, which is going to help you when you perform.
Yeah, that's exactly what I need to know. Beautiful. Well, we've covered some absolutely golden information here. I'm sure plenty of people can get some huge value out of this. So for anyone who might be trying to find you on social media or work with you at all, how can they find you in the big wide world?
So I am on Instagram at the moment as the Holistic Dietitian. So the Holly, as in my name, HOLLY, STIC, dietitian. A bit of play on holistic there. I'm currently working in a practice, but it's going to be changing. So that kind of location of practice will be to be confirmed in the future. But yeah, the best place to find me at the moment would be on Instagram.
Too easy. Well, I'll put the details for that for the Instagram page, and then also if the new practice comes out, by the time this is released, I'll put them down in the page notes as well for everyone to find it. But thank you so much for coming on, Holly. This has been absolutely fantastic. We've gotten some really, really quality information out of here, and hopefully this will help spread some of the good word around to the trekking world about good nutritional practices. So I really, really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I think, the big message here is that I like this kind of saying that there's no such thing as a perfect diet. There's only a diet that's perfect for an individual. So even between trekkers, you might be the same height, the same weight as someone, but what you need for you as an individual could be very different to that other person, and across the whole world of hiking and mountaineering. So keeping that in mind whenever you hear things on the internet or whatever it is that kind of push one way of eating is the only way of eating. There's no such thing. And if you like to eat certain foods, you don't need to cut them out. It all comes down to the context of what you're doing. So keeping that in mind is really important.
Unreal. I think that's a perfect point to end on. How good.
Yeah, awesome.
And there we go, guys. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode today. I hope you got some really great value out of that. If you do ever have any questions about these episodes, please do feel to swing me an email anytime at rowan@summitstrength.com.au. If you did enjoy this episode, it really would mean the world to me. If you can go onto iTunes and leave me a quick review, I'd really appreciate it, and it really is a big step in helping this show grow. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we'll talk to you very, very soon.